Hi! So today we're going to be venturing into the world of one of my favorite books, Inkheart. I don't have much to say as a way of introduction, so let's begin. Inkheart by Cornelia Funke. I do hope I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. Translated from the German by Anthea Bell. For Anna, who even put The Lord of the Rings aside for a while to read this book. Can anyone ask more of a daughter? And for Eleanor, who lent me her name, although I didn't use it for an elf queen. If you are a dreamer, come in. If you are a dreamer, a wisher, a liar, a hoper, a prayer, a magic bean buyer, if you are a pretender, come sit by my fire, for we have some flax golden tales to spin. Come in, come in. Shel Silverstein. Chapter 1. A Stranger in the Night. The moon shone in the rocking horse's eye, and in the mouse's eye, too, when Tolly fetched it out from under his pillow to see. The clock went tick-tock, and in the stillness he thought he heard little bare feet running across the floor, then laughter and whispering, and a sound like the pages of a big book being turned over. L.M. Boston, The Children of Green know. Rain fell that night. A fine, whispering rain. Many years later, Maggie had only to close her eyes and she could still hear it, like tiny fingers tapping on the window pane. A dog barked somewhere in the darkness, and however often she tossed and turned, Maggie couldn't get to sleep. The book she had been reading was under her pillow, pressing its cover against her ear, as if to lure her back into its printed pages. I'm sure it must be very comfortable sleeping with a hard, rectangular thing like that under your head, her father had teased the first time he found a book under her pillow. Go on, admit it. The book whispers its story to you at night. Sometimes, yes, Maggie had said, but it only works for children, which made Mo tweak her nose. Mo. Maggie had never called her father anything else. That night, when so much began and so many things changed forever, Maggie had one of her favorite books under her pillow, and since the rain wouldn't let her sleep, she sat up, rubbed the drowsiness from her eyes, and took it out. Its pages rustled promisingly when she opened it. Maggie thought this first whisper sounded a little different from one book to another, depending on whether or not she already knew the story it was going to tell her. But she needed light. She had a box of matches hidden in the drawer of her bedside table. Mo had forbidden her to light candles at night. He didn't like fire. Fire devours books, he always said, but she was 12 years old, so she surely could be trusted to keep an eye on a couple candle flames. Maggie loved to read by candlelight. She had 5 candlesticks on the windowsill, and she was just holding the lighted match to one of the black wicks when she heard footsteps outside. She blew out the match in alarm. Oh, how well she remembered it, even many years later, and knelt to look out of the window, which was wet with rain. Then she saw him. The rain cast a kind of pallor in the darkness, and the stranger was little more than a shadow. Only his face gleamed white as he looked up at Maggie. His hair clung to his wet forehead. The rain was falling on him, but he ignored it. He stood there, motionless, arms crossed over his chest as if that might at least warm him a little, and he kept on staring at the house. I must go and wake Mo, thought Maggie, but she stayed put, her heart thudding, and went on gazing out into the night, as if the stranger's stillness had infected her. Suddenly, he turned his head, and Maggie felt as if he were looking straight into her eyes. She shot off the bed so fast the open book fell to the floor, and she ran barefoot out into the dark corridor. This was the end of May, but it was chilly in the old house. There was still a light on in Mo's room. He often stayed up reading late into the night. Maggie had inherited her love of books from her father. When she took refuge from a bad dream with him, nothing could lull her to sleep better than Mo's calming breathing beside her, and the sound of the pages turning. Nothing chased nightmares away faster than the rustle of printed paper. But the figure outside the house was no dream. The book Mo was reading that night was bound in pale blue linen. Later, Maggie remembered that too. What unimportant little details stick in the memory. Mo, there's someone out in the yard. Her father raised his head and looked at her with the usual absent expression he wore when she interrupted his reading. It always took him a few moments to find his way out of that other world, the labyrinth of printed letters. "Someone out in the yard. Are you sure?" "Yes. He's staring at our house." Mo put down his book. "So what were you reading before you went to sleep? Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde?" Maggie frowned. "Please, Mo, come and look." He didn't believe her, but he went anyway. Maggie tugged him along the corridor so impatiently that he stubbed his toe on a pile of books, which was hardly surprising. Stacks of books were piled high all over the house, not just arranged in neat rows on bookshelves, the way other people kept them, oh no. The books in Mo and Maggie's house were stacked under tables, on chairs, in the corners of the rooms. There were books in the kitchen and books in the lavatory. Books on the TV set and in the closet. Small piles of books, tall piles of books, books thick and thin, books old and new. They welcomed Maggie down to breakfast with invitingly open pages. They kept boredom at bay when the weather was bad, and sometimes you fell over them. "He's just standing there," whispered Maggie, leading Mo into her room. "Has he got a hairy face? If so, he could be a werewolf." "Oh, stop it!" Maggie looked at him sternly, although his jokes made her feel less scared. Already, she hardly believed any more in the figure standing in the rain, until she knelt down again at the window. "There! Do you see him?" she whispered. Mo looked out through the raindrops running down the pane and said nothing. "Didn't you promise burglars would never break into our house because there's nothing here to steal?" whispered Maggie. "He's not a burglar," replied Mo, but as he stepped back from the window, his face was so grave that Maggie's heart thudded faster than ever. "Go back to bed, Maggie," he said. "This visitor has come to see me." He left the room before Maggie could ask what kind of visitor, for goodness sake, turned up in the middle of the night. She followed him anxiously. As she crept down the corridor, she heard her father taking the chain off the front door, and when she reached the hall, she saw him standing in the open doorway. The night came in, dark and damp, and the rushing of the rain sounded loud and threatening. "Dustfinger," called Mo in the darkness. "Is that you?" Dustfinger? What kind of a name was that? Maggie couldn't remember ever hearing it before, yet it sounded familiar, like a distant memory that wouldn't take shape properly. At first, all seemed still outside except for the rain falling, murmuring as if the night had found its voice. But then, footsteps approached the house, and the man emerged from the darkness of the yard, his long coat so wet with rain that it clung to his legs. For a split second, as the stranger stepped into the light spilling out of the house, Maggie thought she saw a small furry head over his shoulder, snuffling as it looked out of his backpack, and then quickly disappearing back into it. Dustfinger wiped his wet face with his sleeve and offered Mo his hand. "How are you, Silvertongue?" he asked. "It's been a long time." Hesitantly, Mo took the outstretched hand. "A very long time," he said, looking past his visitor as if he expected to see another figure emerge from the night. "Come in. You'll catch your death. Maggie says you've been standing out there for some time." "Maggie? Ah, yes, of course." Dustfinger let Mo lead him into the house. He scrutinized Maggie so thoroughly she felt quite embarrassed and didn't know where to look. In the end, she just stared back. "She's grown. You remember her?" "Of course." Maggie noticed that Mo double-locked the door. "How old is she now?" Dustfinger smiled at her. It was a strange smile. Maggie couldn't decide whether it was mocking, supercilious, or just awkward. She didn't smile back. 12, said Mo. 12? My word. Dustfinger pushed his dripping hair back from his forehead. It reached almost to his shoulders. Maggie wondered what color it was when it was dry. The stubble around his narrow-lipped mouth was gingery, like the fur of the stray cat Maggie sometimes fed with a saucer of milk outside the door. Ginger hair sprouted on his cheeks, too, sparse as a boy's first beard, but not long enough to hide 3 long, pale scars. They made Dustfinger's face look as if it had been smashed and stuck back together again. 12, he repeated. Of course, she was... Let's see, she was 3 then, wasn't she? Mo nodded. Come on, I'll find you some dry clothes. Impatiently, as if he were suddenly in a hurry to hide the man from Maggie, he led his visitor across the hall. And Maggie, he said over his shoulder, you go back to sleep. Then without another word, he closed his workshop door. Maggie stood there, rubbing her cold feet together. Go back to sleep. Sometimes when they'd stayed up late yet again, Mo would toss her down on her bed like a bag of walnuts. Sometimes he chased her around the house after supper until she escaped into her room, breathless with laughter. And sometimes he was so tired he lay down on the sofa and she made him a cup of coffee before she went to bed. But he had never, ever sent her off to her room so briskly. A foreboding, clammy, and fearful, came into her heart, as if, along with the visitor, whose name was so strange yet somehow familiar, some menace had slipped into her life. And she wished, so hard it had frightened her, that she had never gone to get Mo and Dustfinger, and had stayed outside until the rain washed him away. When the door of the workshop opened again, she jumped. "Still there, I see," said Mo. "Go to bed, Meggie. Please." He had that little frown over his nose that appeared only when something was really worrying him, and he seemed to look straight through her as if his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. The foreboding in Maggie's heart grew, spreading black wings. "Send him away, Mo," she said, as he gently propelled her toward her room. "Please, send him away. I don't like him." Mo leaned in her open doorway. "He'll be gone when you get up in the morning. Word of honor." "Word of honor. No crossed fingers?" Maggie looked him straight in the eye. She could always tell when Mo was lying, however hard he tried to hide it from her. "No crossed fingers," he said, holding both hands out to show her. Then he closed her door, even though he knew she didn't like that. Maggie put her ear to it, listening. She could hear the clink of china. So the man with the sandy beard was getting a nice cup of tea to warm him up. I hope he catches pneumonia, thought Maggie. Though he didn't necessarily die of it. Maggie heard the kettle whistling in the kitchen, and Mo carrying a tray of clattering crockery back to the workshop. When that door closed, she forced herself to wait a few more seconds, just to be on the safe side. Then she crept back out into the hallway. There was a sign hanging on the door of Mo's workshop. A small metal plaque. Maggie knew the words on it by heart. When she was 5, she had often practiced reading the old-fashioned, spindly lettering. Some books should be tasted, some devoured, but only a few should be chewed and digested thoroughly. Back then, when she still had to climb on a box to read the plaque, she had thought the chewing and digesting were meant literally, and wondered, horrified, why Mo had hung on his workshop door the words of someone who vandalized books. Now she knew what the plaque really meant, but tonight she wasn't interested in written words. Spoken words were what she wanted to hear. The words being exchanged in soft, almost inaudible whispers by the two men on the other side of the door. "Don't underestimate him," she heard Dustfinger say. His voice was so different from Mo's. No one else in the world had a voice like her father's. Mo could paint pictures in the empty air with his voice alone. "He'd do anything to get hold of it." That was Dustfinger again. "And when I say anything, I can assure you I mean anything." "I'll never let him have it." That was Mo. "He'll still get his hands on it one way or another. I tell you, they're on your trail." "It wouldn't be the first time. I've always managed to shake them off before." "Oh, yes? And for how much longer do you think? What about your daughter? Are you telling me she actually likes moving around the whole time? Believe me, I know what I'm talking about." It was so quiet behind the door that Maggie scarcely dared breathe in case the two men heard her. Finally, her father spoke again, hesitantly, as if his tongue found it difficult to form the words. "Then what do you think I ought to do?" "Come with me, I'll take you to them." A cup clinked, the sound of a spoon against china. How loud small noises sound in a silence. "You know how much Capricorn thinks of your talents. He'd be glad if you took it to him of your own free will. I'm sure he would. The man he found to replace you is useless." Capricorn, another peculiar name. Dustfinger had uttered it as if the mere sound might scorch his tongue. Maggie wriggled her chilly toes and wrinkled her cold nose. She didn't understand much of what the two men were saying, but she tried to memorize every single word of it. It was quiet again in the workshop. "Oh, I don't know," said Mo at last. He sounded so weary it tore at Maggie's heart. "I'll have to think about it." When do you think his men will get here? Soon. The word dropped like a stone into the silence. Soon, repeated Mo. Very well. I'll have made up my mind by tomorrow. Do you have somewhere to sleep? Oh, I can always find a place, replied Dustfinger. I'm managing quite well these days, although it's still all much too fast for me. His laugh was not a happy one. But I'd like to know what you decide. May I come back tomorrow? About midday? Yes, of course. I'll be picking Maggie up from school at 1:30. Come after that. Maggie heard a chair being pushed back and scurried back to her room. When the door of the workshop opened, she was just closing her bedroom door behind her. Pulling the covers up to her chin, she lay there listening as her father said goodbye to Dustfinger. And thank you for the warning anyway, she heard him add as Dustfinger's footsteps moved away, slowly and uncertainly, as if he were reluctant to leave, as if he hadn't said everything he'd wanted to say. But at last he was gone, and only the rain kept drumming its wet fingers on Maggie's window. When Mo opened the door of her room, she quickly closed her eyes and tried to breathe as slowly as you do in a deep, innocent sleep. But Mo wasn't stupid. In fact, he was sometimes terribly clever. Maggie, put one of your feet out of bed, he told her. Reluctantly, she stuck her toes out from under the blanket and laid them in Mo's warm hand. They were still cold. I knew it, he said. You've been spying. Can't you do as I tell you, just for once? Sighing, he tucked her foot back underneath the nice warm blankets. Then he sat down on her bed, passed his hands over his tired face, and looked out of the window. His hair was as dark as moleskin. Maggie had fair hair, like her mother, whom she knew only from a few faded photographs. You should be glad you look more like her than me, Mo always said. My head wouldn't look good at all on a girl's neck. But Maggie wished she did look more like him. There wasn't a face in the world she loved more. I didn't hear what you were saying anyway, she murmured. Good. Mo stared out of the window as if Dustfinger were still standing in the yard. Then he rose and went to the door. Try to get some sleep, he said. But Maggie didn't want sleep. Dustfinger? What sort of a name is that? And why does he call you Silvertongue? Mo did not reply. And this person who's looking for you, I heard what Dustfinger called him. Capricorn? Who is he? No one you want to meet. Her father didn't turn around. I thought you didn't hear anything. Good night, Maggie. This time he left her door open. The light from the hallway fell on her bed, mingling with the darkness of the night that seeped in through the window, and Maggie lay there waiting for the dark to disappear and take her fear of some evil menace away with it. Only later did she understand that the evil had not appeared for the first time that night. It had just slunk back in again. Chapter 2. Secrets. What do these children do without storybooks? Naphtali asked. And Reb Zebulun replied, They have to make do. Storybooks aren't bread. You can live without them. I couldn't live without them, Naphtali said. Isaac Bashevis Singer, Naphtali the storyteller, and his horse, Sus. It was early dawn when Maggie woke. Night was fading over the fields as if the rain had washed the darkness out of the hem of its garment. The alarm clock said just before 5, and Maggie was going to turn over and go back to sleep when she suddenly sensed someone else in the room. Startled, she sat up and saw Mo standing by her open closet door. Hello, he said, putting her favorite sweater in a suitcase. I'm sorry. I know it's very early, but we have to leave. How about cocoa for breakfast? Still drowsy with sleep, Maggie nodded. Outside, the birds were twittering loudly as if they'd been awake for hours. Mo put 2 more pairs of jeans in her suitcase, closed it, and carried it to the door. Wear something warm, he said. It's chilly outside. Where are we going? Asked Maggie, but he had already disappeared. She looked out of the window, feeling confused. She almost expected to see Dustfinger, but there was only a blackbird in the yard, hopping over the stones, which were wet after the rain. Maggie put on her jeans and stumbled into the kitchen. 2 suitcases, a traveling bag, and Mo's toolbox stood out in the hall. Her father was sitting at the kitchen table, making sandwiches for the journey. When she came into the kitchen, he looked up briefly and smiled at her, but Maggie could see he was worried about something. Mo, we can't go away now, she said. The school holidays don't start for another week. Well, it won't be the first time I've had to go away on business during the school term. He was right about that. In fact, he went away quite often, whenever an antique dealer, a book collector, or a library needed a bookbinder and commissioned Mo to restore a few valuable old books, freeing them of dust and mold, or dressing them in new clothes, as he put it. Maggie didn't think the word bookbinder described Mo's work particularly well, and a few years ago she had made him a sign to hang on his workshop door saying, Mortimer Fulchart, Book Doctor. And the book doctor never called on his patients without taking his daughter too. They had always done that, and they always would, never mind what Maggie's teacher said. How about chickenpox? Have you used that excuse already? Yes, last time, when we had to go and see that dreary man with the Bibles. Maggie scrutinized her father's face. Mo, is it because of last night we have to leave? For a moment, she thought he was going to tell her everything, whatever there was to tell, but then he shook his head. No, of course not, he said, putting the sandwiches he had made into a plastic bag. Your mother has an aunt called Eleanor. We visited her once, when you were very small. She's been wanting me to come and put her books in order for a long time. She lives beside a lake in the north of Italy. I always forget which lake, but it's a lovely place, a day's drive away. He did not look at her as he spoke. Maggie wanted to ask, but why do we have to go now? But she didn't. Nor did she ask if he had forgotten that he was meeting someone at midday. She was too afraid of the answers, and she didn't want Mo to lie to her again. Is this aunt as peculiar as the others? Was all she said. Mo had already taken her to visit various relations. Both he and Maggie's mother had large families whose homes, so far as Maggie could see, were scattered over half of Europe. Mo smiled. Yes, she is a bit peculiar, but you'll get along with her all right. She has some really wonderful books. How long are we going to be away? It could be quite some time. Maggie sipped her cocoa. It was so hot she burned her lips and had to quickly press the cold blade of a knife to her mouth. Mo pushed his chair back. I have to pack a few more things from the workshop, he said. It won't take long. You must be very tired, but you can sleep once we're in the van. Maggie just nodded and looked out of the kitchen window. It was a gray morning. Mist drifted over the fields at the foot of the nearby hills, and Maggie felt as if the shadows of the night were still hiding among the trees. Pack up the food and take plenty to read, Mo called from the hall, as if she didn't always. Years ago, he had made her a box to hold her favorite books on all their journeys, short and long, far and near. It's a good idea to have your own books with you in a strange place, Mo always said. He himself always took at least a dozen. Mo had painted the box poppy red. Poppies were Maggie's favorite flower. They pressed well between the pages of a book, and you could stamp a star-shaped pattern on your skin with their pepper pot seed capsules. He had decorated the box and painted Maggie's treasure chest in lovely curling lettering on the lid. The box was lined with shiny black taffeta, but you could hardly see any of the fabric because Maggie had a great many favorite books, and she always added another whenever they traveled anywhere. If you take a book with you on a journey, Mo had said when he put the first one in her box, an odd thing happens. The book begins collecting your memories, and forever after, you have only to open that book, to be back where you first read it. It will all come into your mind with the very first words, the sights you saw in that place, what it smelled like, the ice cream you ate while you were reading it. Yes, books are like flypaper. Memories cling to the printed page better than anything else. He was probably right, but there was another reason why Maggie took her books whenever they went away. They were her home when she was somewhere strange. They were familiar voices, friends that never quarreled with her, clever, powerful friends, daring and knowledgeable, tried and tested adventurers who had traveled far and wide. Her books cheered her up when she was sad and kept her from being bored while Mo cut leather and fabric to the right size and restitched old pages that over countless years had grown fragile from the many fingers leafing through them. Some of her books always went away with Maggie. Others were left at home because they weren't right for where she was going, or to make room for new, unknown stories she hadn't yet read. Maggie stroked their curved spines. Which books should she take this time? Which stories would help drive away the fear that had crept into the house last night? I know, thought Maggie. Why not a story about telling lies? Mo told her lies. He told terrible lies, even though he knew that every time he told one, she looked hard at his nose. Pinocchio, thought Maggie. No, too sinister. And too sad. But she wanted something exciting, a story to drive all the other thoughts out of her head, even the darkest. The witches, yes. She'd take the bald-headed witches who turned children into mice. And the Odyssey, with the Cyclops and the Enchantress who transforms his warriors into pigs. Her journey could hardly be more dangerous than his, could it? On the left-hand side of the box, there were 2 picture books that Maggie had used when she was teaching herself to read. 5 years old she'd been, and you could still see where her tiny forefinger had moved over the pages. And right at the bottom, hidden under all of the others, were the books Maggie had made herself. She had spent days sticking them together and cutting up the paper. She had painted picture after picture, and Mo had to write what they were underneath them. An angel with a happy face, from Maggie for Mo. She had written her name herself, although back then she always left the E off the end. Maggie looked at the clumsy lettering and put the little book back in the box. Mo had helped her with the binding, of course. He had bound all her homemade books in brightly patterned paper, and he had given her a stamp for the others so that she could print her name and the head of a unicorn on the title page, sometimes in black ink and sometimes in red, depending on how she felt. But Mo had never read aloud to her from her books. Not once. He had tossed Maggie up in the air, he had carried her around the house on his shoulders, he had taught her how to make a bookmark of a blackbird's feathers, but he had never read aloud to her. Never once. Not a single word. However often she put books in his lap. Maggie just had to teach herself how to decipher the black marks and open the treasure chest. She straightened up. There was still a little room in the box. Perhaps Mo had a new book she could take, an especially big, fat, wonderful book. The door to his workshop was closed. Mo? Maggie pressed the handle down. The long table where he worked had been swept clean, with not a stamp nor a knife in sight. Mo had packed everything. Had he been lying after all? Maggie went into the workshop and looked around. The door to the treasury was open. The treasury was really just a storage room, but Maggie had given the little cubbyhole that name because it was where her father stored his most precious materials, the finest leather, the most beautiful fabrics, marbled paper, stamped print patterns in gold on soft leather. Maggie put her head around the open door and saw Mo covering a book with brown paper. It was not a particularly large book, and not especially fat. The green linen binding looked worn, but that was all Maggie could see because Mo quickly hid the book behind his back as soon as he noticed her. "What are you doing here?" he snapped. For a moment Maggie was speechless with shock. Mo's face was so dark. "I only wanted to ask if you had a new book for me. I've read all the ones in my room and—" Mo passed his hand over his face. "Yes, of course. I'm sure I can find something," he said, but his eyes were still saying, Go away, Maggie," and the brown paper crackled behind his back. "I'll be with you in a moment," he said. "I have a few more things to pack, okay?" A little later, he brought her 3 books, but the one he had been covering with brown paper wasn't one of them. An hour later, they were taking everything out into the yard. Maggie shivered when she stepped outdoors. It was a chilly morning after the night's rain, and the sun hung in the sky like a pale coin lost by someone high up in the clouds. They had been living in the old farmhouse for just under a year. Maggie liked the view of the surrounding hills, the swallows' nests under the roof, the dried-up well that yawned darkly as if it went straight down to the earth's core. The house itself had always been too big and drafty for her liking, with all those empty rooms full of fat spiders. But the rent was low, and Mo had enough space for his books and his workshop. There was a hen house outside, and the barn, which now only housed their old camper van, would have been perfect for a couple of cows or a horse. "Cows have to be milked, Maggie," Mo had said when she suggested keeping a couple. "Very, very early in the morning. Every day." "Well, what about a horse?" she had asked. "Even Pippi Longstocking has a horse, and she doesn't have a stable." She'd have been happy with a few chickens or a goat, but they, too, had to be fed every day, and she and Mo went away too often for that. So Maggie had only the ginger cat who sometimes came visiting when it couldn't be bothered to compete with the dogs on the farm next door. The grumpy old farmer who lived there was their only neighbor. Sometimes his dogs howled so pitifully that Maggie put her hands over her ears. It was 20 minutes by bike to the nearest village, where she went to school and where 2 of her friends lived, but Mo usually took her in the van because it was a lonely ride along a narrow road that wound past nothing but fields and dark trees. "What on earth have you packed in there, bricks?" asked Mo as he carried Maggie's book box out of the house. "You're the one who says books have to be heavy because the whole world's inside them," said Maggie, making him laugh for the first time that morning. The camper van standing in the abandoned barn like a solid multicolored animal was more familiar to Maggie than any of the houses where she and Mo had lived. She never slept more deeply and soundly than in the bed he had made in it for her. There was a table, too, of course, a kitchen tucked into a corner, and a bench to sit on. When you lifted the seat of the bench, there were travel guides, road maps, and well-worn paperbacks under it. Yes, Maggie was fond of the van, but this morning she hesitated to get in. When Mo finally went back to the house to lock the door, she suddenly felt they would never come back. They would never come back here, that this journey was going to be different than any other, that they would drive farther and farther away, in flight from something that had no name, or at least none that Mo was about to tell her. "Very well, off we go south," was all he said as he got behind the steering wheel. And so they set off, without saying goodbye to anyone, on a morning that still seemed much too early and smelled of rain. But Dustfinger was waiting for them at the gate. Chapter 3. Going South. "Beyond the wild wood comes the wild world," said the rat. "And that's something that doesn't matter, either to you or to me. I've never been there, and I'm never going, nor you either, if you've got any sense at all." Kenneth Grahame. The Wind in the Willows. Dustfinger must have been waiting in the road beyond the wall. Maggie picked her precarious way along the top of that wall hundreds of times, up to the rusty hinges of the gate and back again, eyes tightly closed so she could get a clear view of the tiger she'd imagined waiting in the bamboo at the foot of the wall, his eyes yellow and amber, or the foaming rapids to her right and her left. Only Dustfinger was there now, but no other sight could have made Maggie's heart beat faster. He appeared so suddenly, Mo almost ran him down. He wore only a sweater, and he was shivering, with his arms folded over his chest. His coat was probably still damp from last night's rain, but his hair was dry now, a ruffled, sandy mop above his scarred face. Mo swore under his breath, switched off the engine, and got out of the van. Smiling his strange smile, Dustfinger leaned back against the wall. "Where are you going in such a hurry, Silvertongue? Didn't we have a date?" he asked. "You stood me up like this once before, remember?" "You know why I'm in a hurry," replied Mo, "for the same reason as last time." He was still standing by the open door of the van, looking tense, as if he couldn't wait for Dustfinger to get out of the way, but Dustfinger pretended not to notice Mo's impatience. "Then may I know where you're going?" he inquired. "It took me 4 years to find you last time, and if luck hadn't been on your side, Capricorn's men would have got to you first." When he glanced at Maggie, she stared back icily. Mo was silent for a while. "Capricorn is in the north," he answered at last, "so we're going south. Or has he taken up residence somewhere else now?" Dustfinger looked down the road. Last night's rain shone on the potholes. No, he said. "No, he's still in the north, or so I hear. And since you've obviously made up your mind to go on refusing him what he wants, I'd better go south myself as fast as I can. Heaven knows I don't want to be the one to give Capricorn's men the bad news. So if you'd give me a lift part of the way, I'm ready to leave." The 2 bags he picked up from where they stood by the wall looked as if they'd been all around the world a dozen times. Apart from the bags, Dustfinger had nothing but his backpack with him. Maggie compressed her lips. "No, Mo," she thought. "No, let's not take him." She had only to look at her father to know that his answer would be different. "Oh, come on, Silvertongue," said Dustfinger. "What am I going to tell Capricorn's men if I fall into their hands?" He looked lost, standing there like a stray dog, and hard as Maggie tried to see something sinister about him, she couldn't, not in the pale morning light. All the same, she didn't want him to go with them. Her face showed that very clearly, but neither of the 2 men took any notice of her. "Believe me, I couldn't keep the fact that I've seen you away from them very long," Dustfinger continued. "And, anyway..." He hesitated before completing his sentence. You still owe me, don't you? Mo bowed his head. Maggie saw his hand closing more firmly around the open door of the van. If you want to look at it like that, he said, yes, I suppose I do still owe you. The relief was plain to see on Dustfinger's scarred face. He quickly hoisted his backpack over his shoulders and came over to the van with his bags. Wait a minute, cried Maggie, as Mo moved to help him. If he's coming with us, then I want to know why we're running away. Who is this man called Capricorn? Mo turned to her. Maggie, he began, in the tone she knew only too well. Maggie, don't be silly, it meant. Come along now, Maggie. She opened the van door and jumped out. Maggie, for heaven's sake, get back in. We have to leave. I'm not getting back in until you tell me. Mo came toward her, but Maggie slipped away and ran through the gate into the road. Why won't you tell me? She cried. The road was deserted, as if there were no other human beings in the world. A slight breeze had risen, caressing Maggie's face and rustling in the leaves of the lime tree that grew by the roadside. The sky was still wan and gray, and refused to clear. I want to know what's going on, cried Maggie. I want to know why we had to get up at 5 o'clock and why I don't have to go to school. I want to know if we're ever coming back, and I want to know who this Capricorn is. When she spoke the name, Mo looked around as if the man with the strange name, the man he and Dustfinger obviously feared so much, might step out of the empty barn just as suddenly as Dustfinger had emerged from behind the wall. But the yard was empty, and Maggie was too furious to feel frightened of someone when she knew nothing about him other than his name. You've always told me everything, she shouted at her father. Always. But Mo was still silent. Everyone has a few secrets, Maggie, he said at last. Now come along, do get in. We have to leave. Dustfinger looked first at Mo, then at Maggie with an expression of incredulity on his face. You haven't told her? Maggie heard him ask in a low voice. Mo shook his head. But you have to tell her something. It's dangerous for her not to know. She's not a baby anymore. It's dangerous for her to know, too, said Mo, and it wouldn't change anything. Maggie was still standing in the road. I heard all that, she cried. What's dangerous? I'm not getting in until you tell me. Mo still said nothing. Dustfinger looked at him, uncertain for a moment, then put down his bags. Very well, he said. Then I'll tell her about Capricorn myself. He came slowly toward Maggie, who involuntarily stepped back. You met him once, said Dustfinger. It's a long time ago. You won't remember you were so little. He held his hand at knee-height in the air. How can I explain what he's like? If you were to see a cat eating a young bird, I'd expect you'd cry, wouldn't you? Or try to help the bird. Capricorn would feed the bird to the cat on purpose, just to watch it being torn apart, and the little creature screeching and struggling would be as sweet as honey to him. Maggie took another step backward, but Dustfinger kept advancing toward her. I don't suppose you'd get any fun from terrifying people until their knees were so weak they could hardly stand, he asked. Nothing gives Capricorn more pleasure. And I don't suppose you think you can just help yourself to anything you want, never mind what or where. Capricorn does. Unfortunately, your father has something Capricorn has set his heart on. Maggie glanced at Mo, but he just stood there looking at her. Capricorn can't bind books like your father, Dustfinger went on. In fact, he's not much good at anything, except terrifying people. But he's a master of that art. It's his whole life. I doubt if he himself has any idea what it's like to be so paralyzed by fear that you feel small and insignificant. But he knows just how to arouse that fear and spread it, in people's homes and their beds, in their heads and their hearts. His men spread fear abroad like the Black Death. They push it under doors and through mailboxes. They paint it on walls and stable doors until it infects everything around it of its own accord, silent and stinking like a plague. Dustfinger was very close to Maggie now. Capricorn has many men, he said softly. Most have been with him since they were children, and if Capricorn were to order one of them to cut off your nose or one of your ears, he'd do it without batting an eyelash. They like to dress in black like crows, only their leader wears a white shirt under his black jacket. And should you ever meet any of them, then make yourself small, very small, and hope they don't notice you. Understand? Maggie nodded. Her heart was pounding so hard she could scarcely breathe. I can see why your father has never told you about Capricorn, said Dustfinger, looking at Mo. If I had children, I'd rather tell them about nice people, too. I know the world's not just full of nice people. Maggie couldn't keep her voice from shaking with anger and more than a touch of fear. Oh, yes? How do you know that? There it was again, that mysterious smile. Sad and supercilious at the same time. Have you ever had anything to do with a real villain? I've read about them. Dustfinger laughed aloud. Yes, of course, that almost comes to the same thing, he said. His mockery hurt like stinging nettles. He bent down to Maggie and looked her in the face. All the same, I hope reading about them is as close as you ever get, he said quietly. Mo was stowing Dustfinger's bags in the back of the van. I hope there's nothing in there that might come flying around our heads, he said, as Dustfinger got in the back seat behind Maggie. With your trade, I wouldn't be surprised. Before Maggie could ask what trade that was, Dustfinger opened his backpack and carefully lifted out an animal. It was blinking sleepily. Since we obviously have quite a long journey ahead of us, he told Mo, I'd like to introduce someone to your daughter. The creature was almost the size of a rabbit, but much thinner, with a bushy tail now draped over Dustfinger's chest like a fur collar. It dug its slender claws into his sleeve while inspecting Maggie with its gleaming, beady black eyes, and when it yawned, it bared its teeth as sharp as needles. This is Gwyn, said Dustfinger. You can tickle him behind the ears if you like. He's very sleepy at the moment, so he won't bite. Does he usually? Asked Maggie. Yes, said Bo, getting back behind the wheel. If I were you, I'd keep my fingers away from that little brute. But Maggie couldn't keep her hands off any animal, however sharp its teeth. He's a marten or something like that, right? She asked. Something of that nature. Dustfinger put his hand in his pants pocket and gave Gwyn a piece of dry bread. Maggie stroked his little head as he chewed, and her fingertips found something hard under the silky fur, tiny horns growing beside his ears. Surprised, she took her hand away. Do martens have horns? Dustfinger winked at her and let Gwyn climb back into the backpack. This one does, he said. Bewildered, Maggie watched him fasten the straps. She felt as if she were still touching Gwyn's little horns. Mo, did you know that martens have horns? She asked. Oh, Dustfinger stuck them on that sharp-toothed little devil of his for his performances. What kind of performances? Maggie looked inquiringly first at Mo, then at Dustfinger, but Mo just started the engine, and Dustfinger, who seemed to have come far, judging by his bags, took off his boots and stretched out on Mo's bed in the van with a deep sigh. Don't give me away, Silvertongue, he said before he closed his eyes. I have my own secrets, you know, and for those I need darkness. They must have driven 50 kilometers, and Maggie was still trying to figure out what he could have possibly meant. Mo, she asked when Dustfinger began snoring behind them, what does this Capricorn want from you? She lowered her voice before she spoke the name, as if that might remove some of the menace from it. A book, replied Mo without taking his eyes off the road. A book? Then why not give it to him? I can't. I'll explain soon, but not now, all right? Maggie looked out of the van window. The world they were passing outside already looked unfamiliar. Unfamiliar houses, unfamiliar roads, unfamiliar fields. Even the trees and sky looked unfamiliar. But Maggie was used to that. She had never really felt at home anywhere. Mo was her home. Mo and her books, and perhaps the camper van that carried them from one place to the next. This aunt we're going to see, she said as they drove through an endless tunnel. Does she have any children? No, said Mo, and I'm afraid she doesn't particularly like children either. But, as I said, I'm sure you'll get along well with her. Maggie sighed. She could remember several aunts, and she hadn't gotten along particularly well with any of them. They were driving through mountains now. The slopes on both sides of the road rose ever more steeply, and there came a point where the houses looked not just unfamiliar, but really different. Maggie tried to pass the time by counting tunnels, but when the night swallowed them up and the darkness went on and on, she fell asleep. She dreamed of martens and black jackets, and a book in a brown paper cover. think that's where we'll end for today.